Did you know if you leave a half-full barrel of wine to stand for long enough in the right conditions, a weird alien-looking layer of yeast can form over the top of the wine and totally freak out the more squeamish amongst us? But if this layer of yeast is full and thick and healthy, then it can actually act as a protective layer against oxidation, both passively by creating a physical barrier between the wine and the oxygen, but also actively by consuming the oxygen both in and around the wine. This yeasty layer of Flor doesn't just protect the wine, it has a vibe all of its own which it imparts to the wine. And this vibe is really very important in the flavor development of the sherry wines from Spain, for example, but also from the super weird oxidatively wines of the Jura in France. Incidentally, I love the weird oxidative wines from the Jura in France, but people do get grumpy when you put them in blind tastings because they have bizarre flavors of nuts and musty tobacco and grilled onions. But how do they get to taste this way, you might ask? Well, that layer of yeast that forms over the top of the wine, or Flor, is for the most part made up of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And as we know, this is the most common strain of yeast used in the fermentation of wine or beer or bread. Of course, there are a few other weird strains that have joined the party in the formation of Flor, but for the most part, we're talking about a simple wine yeast. And yet, in this context of Flor formation, this yeast behaves very differently to the way the same yeast would behave during wine fermentation. Obviously, during fermentation, Saccharomyces cerevisiae eats up sugar and produces alcohol. But in this weird silent space of the half-empty barrel, the yeast that forms on top of the wine in fact begins to consume alcohol and convert it into acetaldehyde. As we've mentioned in other places, when you mix a bit of acetaldehyde and a little bit of oxygen and a little bit of thyme, you can trigger all sorts of bizarre flavors in wine. In the context of these particular wines, you can get appley flavors, but also nutty flavors and salty, savory elements, sometimes as bizarre as grilled onions. But Flor does other stuff as well. It can affect the texture of a wine. It can consume glycerol, which we've mentioned earlier plays a role in how we perceive tannins. So if you get rid of that, you create a much drier mouthfeel. And finally, it also affects texture through a process called autolysis. And we've spoken about before, where yeast cells die and sink to the bottom of the tank, and then after a certain time they go bleh, and then they basically spill their guts out into the wine, but in a way that's delicious and creates lovely feathery textures. But we can talk more about autolysis on another day, because it's time to introduce the hand-drink solo wine of the day, which is the Vine Venom SILENCE Flor-aged Chenin Blanc made by winemaker Samantha Suddons. Samantha Suddons is the wine brain behind the brand of Vine Venom, and she is an art history major who came from the United Kingdom to South Africa in order to work in the thriving South African art industry. But instead of ending up in the art industry, she ended up at countless wine tastings in Stellenbosch with young rapscallion up-and-coming winemakers like Rhiannon Borman and Peter van der Merwe. They successfully convinced her that wine was really the only art form that she needed in her life. And so she partially abandoned her idea of an art career and instead became a winemaker. But given her educational background and also just her personal inclinations to be drawn to the expressive and unusual world of art, it should come as very little surprise that the wines that she ended up making are extremely expressive and intense and unusual in their own right. And if you're wondering what sort of unusual I might be referring to, well, you get your answer just by looking at her range of wines. This range includes a multi-vintage red wine rosé from the Swartland, a skin-fermented Chenin Blanc, a rosé made from Flor-aged Carignan and Touriga National, and also a Paardeberg Syrah. And it's worth noting that the last 4 of those wines all earned themselves Platter 4.5-star ratings, with the skin-fermented Chenin Blanc actually going into the 5-star tasting with a chance to win a Platter 5-star. At this point, you should realize that for a skin-fermented Chenin Blanc to make it into the 5-star tasting is a little bit like a Will Ferrell comedy being nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. The nomination alone is remarkable. When we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, there really is a whole bunch going on. And I mentioned earlier the sort of VA and oxidative elements, and these trigger some really quite interesting elements of ginger and those apple notes that I talked, although it's probably like a yellow apple cider. But there are fresher elements as well. There's sort of a chamomile blossom and then some pear fruit, which is quite unexpected in the context of the wine. And moving on from the oxidative elements and then the surprising fresher elements, there's also leesy elements going on. So there's a salty sourdough note, which is lovely. And then beyond that, there's a quite a rich, almost salted farm butter aroma. Perhaps part of that dairy-ish note comes from the fact that all of the components for this wine go fully through malolactic fermentation in their barrels. And as we've mentioned, malolactic conversion takes malic acid, which is bright and tart and green apple and unripe pear, and it turns it into lactic acid, which is a little creamier, a little softer, and adds a bit of a richer mouthfeel. When we give it a sip, well, when we taste this wine, it kind of defies the wine theory, because in the same vineyard at the same time that Samantha Suddons is harvesting, you have guys like Tremaine Smith and Jasper Wickens harvesting the Chenin in order to make Petnat or MCC. Now, when you're harvesting for those sorts of wines, you want to harvest with very high acid, lower ripeness, lower obvious fruit elements. Samantha then goes on to say that after fermentation is done, the process of Flor aging or biological aging further reduces the presence of fruit and adds instead sort of salty green olive and oxidative notes. The reason that I say that the wine defies wine theory is because when I taste this particular wine, I think the fruit is really quite well formed. There are lovely elements of sweeter yellow apple, fresh pear, just like we smelt on the nose. And then there's also elements of bright tart apricot, which I find delightful. Sam, as the winemaker, completely refutes my stone fruit observation. She says, nay. For her, the wine is more about lemon citrus and perhaps some winter melon, and it really could be. So my request to you is that you get into the glass and in fact come up with some flavor notes yourself, and then let me know, have I got a stone fruit hallucination? Finally, all controversy over fruit aside, there is an undeniable, delicious, waxy, feathery texture to the entire wine. We spoke earlier about how autolysis can do that, but there seems to be something else going on as well, which makes this wine just incredibly interesting to drink, not only because of the flavors, but also because of that texture on the palate. As I suggest from time to time, try keeping the wine in your mouth for a little bit longer so that you can really experience that texture. And an added bonus is if you do that, you'll find a lot of those salty sourdough umami elements starting to come to the fore, and really the entire wine reveals a whole new layer of intrigue. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you have any questions about Flor or about Samantha Suddons or about Chenin Blanc in South Africa, then drop those questions onto the website and I will then go and get back to you with the best answers I have at my disposal. I will also leave a link to a very interesting article by Lustau, the sherry producer, and all the work they're doing in isolating various yeast strains that they use in the production of Flor on their wines. If you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon to help us make more of these sorts of videos, and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel so that you can find all of our videos about wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, rising winemaking stars, and some of the fascinating styles of wine that are coming out of the unique South African wine.